The citadel breathed like a living thing, a cathedral of gold and glass perched on the shoulder of a scarlet world. Its spires curved like frozen music, its floors were mirrors, and its air hummed with the low heartbeat of engines buried miles below. The royal procession rippled down its luminous spine, a thread of color and power moving toward the throne chamber where the Scepter Gate waited. The gate remembered everything. It held the first wars, the first treaties, the first betrayals like ghosts in its light. The war had ended 1,000 years ago, and still the galaxy carried its scars among the stars. Empires wore them like jewelry, smaller peoples treated them like maps. Humanity, latecomer to this theater of old wounds and older oaths, wore its scars quietly, stitched into the practicality of ships that could function even when starved of parts, into the grit that had let them claw a living from the cold. A human walked with the procession, a slim figure keeping pace with beings twice his height and broad as doors. Elias Rye had the posture of one who listened easily and slept lightly. His suit was plain black and pressed, his boots scuffed from corridors that never bothered with carpets. He carried no blade, wore no jewels, bore no crest. The only family he had were on a planet he hadn't seen in 6 years, and the only oath he'd given was to a ship that no longer flew. He had been invited as witness, humanity's little envoy in this empire of water-born royals whose veins shone faintly blue under their silvered skin. Their queen had died, and by the rhythms of their tides, a new sovereign must be crowned. They called it the binding, light, oath, blood. They had brought their dukes and barons, their daughters and bonded knights. They had brought warriors who moved like dancers and princes with eyes pale as the ocean, each ready to kneel beneath the Scepter Gate and receive the affirmation of the throne. The gate recognized blood and duty and 1,000 unseen currents. It had never faltered. The procession poured into the throne chamber and found the world inside it. The ceiling was a bowl of stars, the floor a lake of polished stone. Between stood the Scepter Gate, tall as 10 men, a ring of metal veined with living light. The gate's inner face rippled with fractal symbols no one fully understood. When the first duke stepped beneath it, the symbols softened and arranged themselves into the seal of his house. The crowd sighed like wind in silk. When the second passed, the gate flared and sang 2 notes. When the third, a small glow for minor blood. They went in order, a precise choreography of heritage. The gate accepted them one by one, acknowledged them and let them pass. No one watched Elias. He stood at the side beside a column whose gold was old, hands folded behind him to hide the small tremor he'd never quite conquered since the freighter's last plunge into the gas giant's edge. He listened to the notes and thought of waves. Then the princess stepped forward, the dead queen's niece, hair braided with cobalt thread. She moved with the bearing of someone who had trained for this room since childhood and feared it would always belong to someone else. The gate greeted her with a warm cascade of light. A whispered ripple moved the length of the chamber, princess favored, princess chosen. The master of tides smiled with the relief of a man whose mathematics had finally proved true. Protocols carried them forward. The royals diminished in rank and blood fraction. Members of the allied houses came last, an honor that was also a dismissal. The gate acknowledged them only to note their place outside the circle. Nevertheless, they were proud to be recognized by a mechanism that had witnessed empires rise and fall. An officer of the guard gestured curtly to the final cluster, off-world ambassadors, trade representatives, and one human. Elias lifted his chin, surprised that the ceremony extended so far. He stepped into the line because that was the polite thing, and because he had always moved in ships and in crowds by the current of the moment. An insectoid ambassador clicked through the gate. It chimed politely and dimly. A rock-skinned trader followed, a spark and a sigh. Then Elias felt the space toward which he was meant to walk open like an intake of breath. He didn't want the eyes, but he had learned that when the galaxy looked at you for a moment, it was better to meet it with steady feet. So he stepped forward and under the Scepter Gate. Light fell like rain. It gathered along the ring, cascaded into the air behind his shoulders, braided itself into sigils he had never seen. The gate shook, not physically but in the way a living thing might shudder when the cold finds its bones. A note rang out, deep and far beneath hearing. The visible light contracted into a single bright seam running straight down the center of the gate like a spine. Everything froze. The chamber's murmur died. Guards half-lifted weapons, then remembered they were ceremonial. Some noble dropped a ring. It struck the floor with a ping that registered as a minor panic in the stillness. The gate's light expanded again. It formed a symbol none of them could name, though the oldest among them felt in it the tug of a story their grandmothers had whispered when the tide ran quiet. Words, white and undecorated, strobed across the inner face of the gate in a tongue anyone could read. Crownless King detected. The silence had weight. It was the weight of pressure in deep oceans, the crush of vacuum around a hull. Elias felt it settle on his shoulders like a cloak. He did not move. He could feel the faint tack of sweat along his spine, the slow hammer of his pulse, the way the gate's light stroked the edges of his silhouette as if tasting it. Malfunction, someone said. It was the Master of Tides, voice raw. Reset. The gate did not reset. Its light steadied around Elias like the first dawn. Guards moved, then held. Nobles breathed again, sharp intakes, small gasps. The princess, who would have been queen in a few breaths, lifted her chin and stepped forward with controlled grace. "What is your name?" she asked. "Elias Rye," he said, and his voice carried farther than he expected. "Of what house?" "Of none." "Of what world?" "Earth," he said, aware of the 1,000 vowels Earth had collected in alien mouths. Earth, Uit, Eth, and knew that it always sounded small and stubborn and green. Humanity. The princess looked at the gate. It offered no explanation. Behind her, the Master of Tides closed his eyes and pressed his thumb into his palm as if the pain might jolt the world into sense. Behind him, courts shifted like a field of grass in contrary winds. Derision and fear, amusement and predatory curiosity. A tall knight in black stepped closer to Elias and the gate. The knight's armor drank light. His face was a map of old fights and careful truce. "Step away," he said softly to Elias. "Before someone decides fear is safer than patience." Elias did not know whether he wanted to move. He had spent his life in rooms where he did not belong, on decks that swayed and in ports whose laws changed with the wind. But he had never stood at a fulcrum. He had never felt the universe lean. He took a step forward out of the gate's circle. The light did not follow, but it did not extinguish. It kept the words burning in the air. Crownless King detected, stark as bone. The Master of Tides lifted his staff and struck the floor once. The sound moved like a ripple across the chamber. "We proceed," he declared. Ritual reasserted itself with the relief of a system rebooting. The princess returned to the front, though the angle of her shoulders had shifted from certainty to contained fury. The remaining formalities limped forward. Oaths were spoken, small knives touched to palms, a new seal blazed onto a standard, and the gate, hesitating as if embarrassed, finally flared in the shape of the throne's ancient mark. It should have ended there. But nothing ended when a story that had slept 1,000 years sat up and opened its eyes. The whispers began before the ceremony closed. They grew teeth and legs as courtiers took them out into the galleries and fed them to friends. By the time the sun turned the citadel windows to fire, the story had crossed half the planet, and the relay net had sent it to the nearest listening post, where men and women ran their hands through their hair and asked what a crownless king was supposed to be and whether they should invest in more armor. Elias did not run. He returned to the rooms the embassy had loaned him. the ones with a narrow window and a view of the starport like a necklace of lights on the dark. He rinsed his face and watched the water spin briefly like a tiny galaxy in the bowl before it slipped away. The lights along the baseboard shifted to indicate someone at his door. "Open," he said. The princess entered without ceremony, without guards. She had changed out of ceremonial brilliance into a tunic and trousers like the ones her training masters wore. She looked pointedly at his chair, and then, when he didn't offer it, pulled a crate from the small table and sat herself. "What did you do?" she asked. "I walked under the gate," Elias said, "like everyone else. What did you do to it?" "I didn't touch it." "It touched you," she said flatly. "It called you king. It called me crownless." She considered him. Under the flowing coils of her sea-blue hair, her eyes were steady and very tired. "Our myths say the gate answers to patterns in blood, no more, no less." "Our myths say the sea once owned the sky," Elias said. "They also say a star can be healed with prayer. You have no houses, you have no binding wars here, no tides." She leaned forward. "You have no crowns. Perhaps that's exactly the point," Elias said softly. They let the room hold that. Her voice changed, small and private. "There will be those who say the gate has chosen, that I am not queen. I'm sorry." "Are you?" She smiled with one corner of her mouth. "It doesn't matter what we feel tonight. It matters what happens tomorrow. Our empire is bound by symbols as much as fleets, and symbols have teeth." Elias wanted to laugh. He wanted to step back under the gate and ask it to laugh with him, but the memory of the way the words had burned made his hands cold. "I don't want your throne," he said. "I don't want mine either if someone goes digging for one." "Wanting is irrelevant," she said. "History is greedy." She stood. "I am Lyra Vesper. Tomorrow I am queen because we have no mechanism to say otherwise without inviting blood on the floor, but there will be knives for you in the morning." She looked at his bare walls, his single bed. "Sleep with the door locked." He smiled without humor. "I always do." That night the citadel dreamed. It dreamed of water under stars. It dreamed of a gate that watched. It dreamed of a human with no crest and 1,000 ancestors who had named themselves by their work because no one else would. The dream poured through vents and into joints, into conference rooms where ministers drafted statements, into the barracks where knights turned in their sleep. It slipped into the founder servers that ran the gate's inner language, and there, something old and unafraid stirred like a whale rising. At dawn, the news broke like storm surf across the capital. Pirates at the system edge, then more than pirates, a fleet stitched from the ragged flags of a dozen failed kingdoms. Behind them something else, a black-mirrored wedge that ate radar pings and returned only silence. The silence moved like a knife. The throne room had not been cleared of flowers. Lyra stood among them and received hurried updates. The Master of Tides spoke of deployment curves. The admirals gave her numbers that felt like prayers with math strapped to them. The Scepter Gate stood empty, dark as if in thought. Elias stayed where he had been placed, near a pillar as if he had grown there. He watched maps become war. He watched a queen choose not to sit down. It was a modular empire, currents instead of roads, alliances lashed together like rafts. Its fleets were beautiful and designed for maneuver in 100 gravitational fields. Its soldiers trained for corridors and seas. But what came in from the dark did not play. The first skirmish went sideways, the second spun out into ad hoc bravery, and a retreat that saved most of a carrier and none of its small craft. The black wedge cut through comms like a scythe. When the third clash came, it didn't happen at all because the enemy was already past the pickets and 2 days inside the orbit line. Elias did not say a word. He thought of the last transmission he had received from the freighter that had been his life for 8 years, the one that had descended into the storm bands of a gas giant with a jury-rigged scoop and never climbed out. The captain had laughed on the channel, a sound like gravel and love. "If the hose holds, we drink tonight," she had said. "If it doesn't, someone else will know where not to drink." He thought of that, and he watched the enemy burn a station, and he wanted to put his fist through the gate. Lyra issued orders with the clarity of a bell and the steadiness of rock. Evacuate the outer habitation rings, open the lower locks, flood the tidal fields, it slows their landing craft, shift the Aegis arcs to cover corridors B through H, bring the old Pix online if you have to, get me the Black Shallows, get me anyone who's fought without a fleet under them. They got her mercenaries, retired pirates, the crews who ran the mining rigs on the system's coldest moon. They got her a human who knew how to take a ship and make it love him. It began small. Elias stepped into a room where pilots strapped themselves into suits that smelled of last week's oil and fear. Their commander, a woman with short hair and an accent from a world that spun too fast, looked him up and down and did not laugh. "You're the Crownless King," she said. "I'm a man with two hands." He said, "I'd like to help." "How?" He pointed at a schematic throne on the wall, the underside of the citadel, the engine rooms, the water processing plants, the elevator that fed supplies to the lower docks. "They're coming from below as well as above," he said. "Everyone forgets the under. Humans don't. We live there." She looked at him, at his scuffed boots, at the steadiness of someone who had learned to keep breathing when valves failed. "Take 10, she said. "Take the bad ones. Get them to follow you." He took the bad ones, the fighters with too much edge, the ones whose hands shook until the switch flipped and then they were beautiful. He told them where to stand and where not to, how to look at a bulkhead and see its ghosts. He led them through corridors and into the lower locks where he locked his jaw against the memory of long pressure and the way lungs scream when they're asked to carry too much water. They made traps. They opened doors at the wrong times. They turned shadows into allies. Up above, in rooms with tall windows, the gate watched. When Elias passed beneath it to get from one part of the fight to another, it whispered a fraction of a tone. He pretended he didn't hear. The black wedge reached the inner orbit. It let smaller ships bloom like spores, and the spores spread to the citadel's anchor points where they clung and ate. The nights went out like bright knives. They died in arcs of light that were poems, and the enemy turned them into footnotes. Lyra watched a screen that lied in clean lines. She kept her voice level. "Bring the river shields to full," she said. "All levels. The power draw," someone began. "Do it," she said, and her staff hit the floor with the echo of the last ceremony that had mattered. The shields came up with a sound like thunder remembered. Enemy landing craft struck and stuttered. For a heartbeat, the citadel shone like a lantern in a storm. People who had never prayed closed their eyes. It held and then it didn't. Nothing ever does forever. The outer arms failed first. The enemy swarmed through. The fine-voiced courtiers who had spoken of art made the practical noises of those who don't want to die. The underlevels shook and shivered. Elias felt a beam shudder overhead and threw up his arm and took a cut along the side of his face that felt like a piece of a new map being carved onto him. He and his 10, now 8, held an access tunnel where the enemy's map had a gap. He sent one to run power to a corroded emergency hatch and another to hold a line with a gun whose recoil turned his shoulder to meet. He hoped for a quiet heroism. He got noise. They broke through like a gray tide. The armor was ugly and the faces behind it angrier. They were the kind of soldiers who fought because it was employment and because someone had hurt them early, often forever. Elias had known men and women like them. He had been born on a street where anger was the first language. He did not forgive, but he understood. "Back," he said, and fell back, counting under his breath, watching the stones where the floor was slick, listening for the hiss that would tell him the hatch had finished, remembering how to open. Numbers mattered. He reached 3 and heard the hiss and palmed the old manual lever, and the hatch slid up with a complaint that his bones felt the way an old man feels weather. They poured through, and he dropped it, and the first enemy soldier slammed into it, and the second and the third, and the hatch held. He let himself breathe for 5 heartbeats and then moved. Breathing was not a plan. He made plans out of where hands fit on metal and the way light bent around corners. He made plans out of memory. Underdeck pump station, he said. If we don't hold it, they take the docks. If they take the docks, they take grain. If they take grain, they take people. Move. They moved. He began to understand the shape of this fight. It was a storm, and the only way through a storm is through. The black wedge came lower, skimming the outer shields, carving corridors of silence where comms died. Lyra watched it with the first expression of true fear he had seen on her face. The Master of Tides whispered to those servers that had known the gate since their grandparents' were copper and dust. The gate listened with something like pity. That was when the citadel trembled, lifted, and everyone in it realized the unthinkable. The enemy had attached engines to the lower docks. The black wedge was trying to tear the city from its moorings. Elias felt the strain in the floor like a change in gravity. He put his hand against the wall and imagined stress lines moving through it, imagined rivets he couldn't see singing with the effort not to break. He looked at the 10, now 7 faces around him and saw men and women who would hold until they broke because someone had to. Hold 2 minutes, he said. Then drop back to the spillway. When the docks lift, there'll be a vacuum surge. Strap in. Use the pipes. If it goes, it goes. But it's not going to go if we give it our 2 minutes. When he moved, something in the enemy moved to follow, like a mouth finding an artery. He lured them into a choke and gave them a personnel door that was sometimes a door and sometimes a wall. It became a wall. The pressure in the corridor tried to turn him into a thin, angry man on a floor. He kept moving. He reached the pump station. He chose to love machines because people needed him too. He had always been good with machines because he treated them like weather. Not alive, not dead, simply what is. He set his hands on the failing pumps and spoke to them without words. He closed a valve like pressing a wound. He opened the emergency baffles in a sequence designed to break a different problem and made it solve this one. He listened to the rhythm and gave it a counter beat, and the pumps found their feet. The pressure stabilized enough to scrape through a needle's eye. He felt the city breathe. He saw his 7 become 6, then 5, then 6 again because someone had stood back up once the world turned and decided it would take a harder swing later. He took a breath that tasted like hot metal and tears and called the command channel. "This is Elias Rye," he said. "The lower docks are still attached. We can hold them if you give me." "Who?" Someone demanded, too much panic. "Crownless," someone else whispered. Lyra's voice cut through. "What do you need?" He measured the ask against his fear of asking. "I need to move the gate." The silence that answered him was not calm silence. It was moral, ceremonial, the weight of old rules and the future looking over their shoulders. He filled it because it would only grow if he let it. "The gate speaks to everything," he said. "Not just blood. It's wired into the oldest bones of this place. I think it can talk to the city's spine. If I can wake it to that, you think?" The Master of Tides' voice was old and bleeding. "I know how to make a machine remember what it was built for," Elias said. "You asked me this morning what I did. I listened. Now I'm telling you what it told me." Lyra did not confer. "Do it," she said. He ran. The underlevels had become small wars. He ran through men who did not know his name, past women who watched him and did not understand why their shoulders felt lighter, through a smell of old salt and copper wires. He came up into a chamber where flowers still bowed their heads and the Scepter Gate stood waiting like the spine of a whale lit from within. The gate recognized his outline. It brightened. "Crownless King detected." It wrote across the air again, as if it had been waiting to echo itself. Guards tensed and then stood down because they knew his face and because their queen had not spoken. Elias put his hands on the gate. The metal under the light was warm. The light hummed. He hadn't asked for any of this and the universe did not care. "You were built to name a shape," he said to it, and felt ridiculous and then holy. "A crown is only a circuit. This city is a greater one. Make the circuit. Bind the flow. If I'm anything to you, use me. If I'm nothing, use me anyway." The light went white. It surged through him like cold, then like warm. His knees went soft and he gripped the arch with his fingers because he was not going to kneel for a machine. The gate reached through itself into the ancient servers and the buried bones, and the warp in the floor where the city had been welded to rock. It found pathways that had once carried ceremonial music and pushed power through them. It found old oath transmitters and made them sing at frequencies that vibrated locked couplings until they remembered their original shape. It spoke to the docks. It told them a story about belonging. The black wedge felt the pull and pushed back, engines snarling like wolves that had found a bigger wolf in the forest. Cables screamed. Floors bucked. People clung. In the pump station, an overstressed rivet let go and became a bright wing that kissed a woman's cheek and made it bleed, and she grinned because this at least was something she could hit back. Elias held the gate while it poured him out like water into a system. He felt, in the way one feels pressure changes, not knowledge but drift, a wordless map of strain and force. He saw the city the way a spine sees a body: balance, load, fault. There, he said, and the gate focused, and the anchoring couplings glowed from within the rock where no one could see them, and locked. He said it again. There, and the city leaned, objected, then obeyed, shifting weight like a fighter who remembers to drop a shoulder. The black wedge did one last ugly thing. It fired a cutting beam that sliced through the lower dock skin and reached for the small glowing hearts of children's wards and hospitals and the kitchens where people had started baking because at the end of the world one should eat bread. Lyra saw it. She had been unyoked from ceremony since morning. She did the only thing she could. She told the remaining knights to form a wall that had no thickness, only promise. They did. They flared out like a fan of light. They did not survive. But the beam flickered, glanced aside, struck a pool where it turned water to steam and sent a cloud into the air that held the smell of salt for a heartbeat and reminded everyone of home. The Black Wedge's captain, who had once believed in a country that had eaten him, decided the cost of this city was too high. He called the retreat on a channel so tight only ghosts could hear it. His ships peeled away. The wedge turned with a slow grace that made people hate it because it contained no apology. It left. The people it left behind did not cheer. Some cried in the small private way of people who have survived a diagnosis they told no one about. Some sat down because standing felt like too much of a statement. Some went to the lower docks and began to sweep because there is nothing else to do when you cannot fix a thing but you love it. Elias let go. The gate cooled. It lowered its light to a dignified glow, and the words it had written dissolved like mist. He turned to find Lyra standing in the doorway with half the court behind her and blood drying along one side of her face where a fragment of something had kissed her. She looked at the gate, at the man who had touched it and lived. "The city holds," she said, "because of you." "Because we held it," Elias said. You moved a thing that should not move." "So have we all," he said, and realized he was too tired to stand. He sat on the floor. A guard started and then looked at Lyra, and she inclined her head, and the guard looked away because some ceremonies are better than the ones they write in books. The Master of Tides limped closer, his staff tapping the floor, the sound now a punctuation to breathe rather than commands. His eyes were wet, not with grief but the relief of men who have added up a column of wrong numbers until the last line gives them the truth anyway. He looked at Elias as if he had known him his whole life. "The gate is an oath," he said. "It measures alignment between a thing we say and a thing we are. It found in you a circuit." "I didn't want it," Elias said. "I still don't." "So much the better," the old man murmured. The court wanted to say many things. They wanted to crown him and cast him out, to bless him and put him in a very polite cell. The desire tangled in their throats and turned into silence because the simplest things were truer. On the other side of the city, women were still binding wounds. Children were counting the missing and then counting again. A where and a when mattered more than a who. Elias slept. When he woke, the city had the look places have when the first wave has been cleaned and the second has not yet broken. Edges bare, eyes clear, hands already reaching for brooms again. The gate stood the way old dogs stand, as they always have. Lyra came without crown. She sat on the floor across from him because she had slept there too, because something in the proximity of someone who had been inside the gate with her city comforted her like a familiar song. "Thank you," she said simply. "You're welcome," he said. "I told them," she went on, voice rough. "I told them you wouldn't wear a crown, I told them I would, and that if they wanted to argue, they could argue with victories." He smiled. It made his face ache where the cut had closed crooked. "How did that go?" "They decided perhaps a ceremony can be performed twice," she said, dry. "And we'll do it without the audience. Just me and the gate and the engineers who maintain its supports." "You'll make a good queen," he said. "I'll make a tired one," she replied. "But I have seen our city hold. I know how to love it now. My grandmother used to say love is a kind of engine." He thought of pumps and valves, of the way pressure equalizes not because you want it to, but because you allow it to. "Yes," he said, "it is." They stood. People had taken to nodding to Elias in corridors. Some touched their fingers to their brow in a gesture that had not been invented before yesterday. He made a point of returning each nod and ignoring the gestures, because he did not want to slice the world into those who had, and those who had not. He went back to the places where the underlevel stank of burned wire, and put his hands on panels, and said things in a language without words, until systems that thought they had died remembered the possibility of one more hour, then one more. The rumor returned that the enemy was gathering. It had the brittle sound of a lie that wants to be true. They were not done with the city. The Black Wedge had not gone to sleep. It had gone to fetch knives. Lyra convened her war council in a room with windows that looked toward the water fields. She invited no courtiers and 6 engineers. She invited Elias and the commander who had given him 10. "We cannot hold this twice," one admiral said. "We will die beautifully or ugly." "Or we will not die," Lyra said. "Because dying is a plan only if we can do it once and stop the universe with it. Are we gods?" No one said yes. It was comfort. Elias stood by a wall and watched them draw lines. He traced them in his head the way he used to trace routes through asteroid belts with his captain, calculating drift and the variance that leaks in when a ship is tired. He did not offer a plan until they had exhausted theirs. When he did, the room went still because his voice had acquired a gravity he did not want. 2 days, he said. They are circling. They want to bite 2 days from now when our repair lines are at their longest and our nerves at their shortest. Good, let them. Move the Aegis arcs into a shape that looks like an invitation, a mouth. Then when they bite, we close it, but not with ships, with the city. The city, an admiral said. Buildings don't fight. They can, Elias said softly. If they are taught to, we've thought of the gate as a crown and as a bridge. Think of it as a switch. It found the city's spine already. It can find the muscles. We run power through the old ceremonial circuits. We align the water fields and the river shields into a coil. We use the underlevel pumps as heart. We ask the city to stand up. And do what? Lyra asked. Move, Elias said. He looked at the gate, even though it was not in the room. We pull the city a fraction of a degree off its mooring at the moment they expect us at rest. They fire, we are not there. Then we are. The difference between a direct hit and a miss is the width of a breath. The room did not laugh at him. They were too near the edge where men laugh only when their feet come down safe. We could tear ourselves apart, the master of tides said. We nearly did already, Elias replied. And we learned how to hold. Now we teach ourselves how to move. Lyra nodded once, decisive. Do it. He went to the gate again because everything he was now looped through that circle. He did not know if it had a soul. He suspected it had accrued one despite anyone's intentions, the way a tool becomes a friend when handed through enough hands. He told it the plan like a story you offer a child who is both brilliant and literal. The gate accepted the story, wrote nothing. It pulsed once. He slept in intervals. He woke to check lines and went back to sleeping upright by a panel. People began calling him by title he could not stop, Crownless. He pretended it was a joke. He pretended he didn't hear woman on the pump station platform tell her child that some kings stand up and some kneel and some crawl under the floor and fix what's broken. 2 days. The enemy came like rain. The black wedge at the center, flanked by teeth. The courtiers watched from far rooms because they did not know what else to do. The engineers clenched their hands. The fighters kissed their knuckles or their knives or the small symbols their children had made them and tucked in pockets. Lyra stood on the gate's platform. She wore no crown because there was no ceremony for this besides urgency. "City," she whispered, and Elias almost reached for her hand, though he hadn't held anyone's like that since the freighter fell. "Stand with me." The gate's light rose. It threaded itself through the vents, the floors, the hidden channels. It touched the underlevel pumps and said, "Wake." It stroked the river shields and the water fields and said, "Now." It found the old couplers that had been meant to bind ground to sky in a metaphor and made them functional. The enemy fired. The city moved. It was not dramatic. No one watching understood what they'd seen until after. It was a breath drawn at the perfect wrong second, a sway like a dancer avoiding a clumsy partner, a slip along a groove no one had known was there. The first volley sang past and wasted itself against the dark. The black wedge corrected. It fired again at where the city was going, smarter now. The city moved another fraction. The volley shaved a tower. Glass fell like summer hail, but no one died there. "Close," Elias said, voice low, and the gate responded with a tone that was the size of a cathedral and the age of a cliff. The city slid back into place with the small satisfaction of a puzzle piece. The enemy realized too late. The citadel's river shields flared open like the petals of a metal flower. They focused not outward but inward and then flung the gathered light back in a layered lattice that the wedge's very new mathematics had not accounted for because no one sends a city to war. It struck the black wedge along the plains of its silence. The wedge's engines hiccuped. Its skin, so proud of eating radar, became confused in a fabric it suddenly inhabited instead of rejected. "Now," Lyra said, and the knights who had not died and the pilots who had held and the mercenaries who had come for money and stayed because of respect all moved at once in a pattern that would have been poetry if poetry bled. The wedge faltered. The mouth closed. They did not break it. The wedge had been designed by men who had lost everything and built the rest from pieces of dark. But they knocked the teeth loose. The wedge turned to go. Elias wanted more than retreat. He wanted end. He wanted no child on a pump station ever to look at a shadow between stars and wonder if she would taste that shadow in her mouth. He put his hands on the gate and said a word that was not a word. The gate reached back into the city and beyond the city into the planet and beyond the planet into the small curving gravity lines that lace a system. It gave a nudge. Not much. A pebble kicks a boulder. The boulder does not move, unless it was already moving. The wedge was. The nudge made a difference in the 14th decimal place that became an asteroid's edge becoming a bite instead of a miss. The wedge took a scar that it would carry like a memory into every map it used later. They did not destroy it, but they made it honest. It fled. Silence came after battle. It is always tender. Someone coughed. Someone else laughed too hard and then could not stop. Lyra stood very still under the gate and let herself feel nothing for a count of 100 because if she felt everything she would flood the room. Then she let herself feel a single thing, gratitude so focused she could aim with it. She aimed it at the gate and at the man whose hands lay on it. The city began the second work of war, counting, hauling, mourning, rebolting. It is less dramatic than fighting, but it is the part that wins. Elias moved among them until his body made him stop. He woke with a blanket he did not own tucked under him, and someone's handwriting on it that said in a language he couldn't read, "We know." He did not wear a crown, but people addressed him as if he did. When petitions came, they came to Lyra. When broken machines came, they came to him. The Master of Tides had him sit in on sessions where the engineers mapped the new circuits the gate had convinced the city it had always had. "We will forget this in 3 generations," the old man said dryly. "Best to write it down." "Why 3? Memory does not like things that demand it be brave," he said. An envoy arrived from a neighboring world with a treaty held like a flower he hoped someone would like. He looked at Elias and hesitated, not with contempt but with fear of misusing a ceremony he had not learned. Elias smiled and took the hand extended. "We sign with you," he said. "We stand." News spread. It told the truth with exaggerations around the edges. It made Elias taller, the gate more merciful, the battle shorter. He let it. Humans have always lived by stories braided from the twine of truth and the bright thread of need. A farmer on a distant moon would stand straighter tomorrow because she heard that a city had moved to save itself. Lyra asked him once, months later, on a balcony where wind pulled at their hair, "Why do you think the gate named you?" He watched ships wheel between stars. He thought about the feel of the gate under his hands, the way it had recognized not his blood but his refusal. "Maybe it was telling me what it needed," he said. "And what do you need?" she asked. He had thought about it in the empty hours when machines whispered and sleep would not. He had thought he needed to leave, to keep moving, to stay no one's emblem. But he looked down at a city whose lights drew new constellations not because they dazzled but because they stayed lit. "To work," he said simply. "Then I will give you work," Lyra said and did. Rebuilding and rerouting, a program to teach the underlevel children the math of pumps and angles. A team to research the gate's language and not make of it a god. She gave him rooms with a bigger window and a bed wider than his outstretched arms, and he used the bed mostly to lay maps on. Whispers persisted in corners where people liked to play with sharp toys. "He is the king." "He isn't. He will take the throne." "He doesn't want it, which means he's dangerous." "He wants nothing, which means he's safe." The words folded on themselves until they were either meaningless or prophecy. He ignored them because ignoring them was a muscle he had trained since a boy, making his way past men who liked breaking small things. A year turned. The city had its scars and tattoos. It wore them with the practical pride of someone who has chosen to heal. The black wedges country fractured further. Out on a station no one had repaired properly. A man lifted a bottle and offered it to a woman who had kept his life with her hands. They toasted a city they had never seen and a queen they had never elected and a king who wore work gloves. And the gate, it stood, silent and impatient, as if waiting for the next child to run a hand along it and ask it to name them brave. Elias visited it alone, sometimes at odd hours when light made the chamber feel both empty and crowded. Crownless, it had called him. He liked the word now, turned it in his mouth like a seed. There is a freedom in not wanting the thing those around you worship. There is a price in it too. He paid both without receipt. He set his palm against the arch and thought of his captain's laugh, of Earth's gray harbor where gulls had screamed like laughter too. He thought of men who had asked him to kneel and he had shrugged instead. He thought of children learning to bind a wound and wire a panel with equal calm. He thought of warm bread. He thought of Lyra, her hands steady over a piece of new legislation, her hair unadorned, the tenderness she saved for talking to a mechanic whose mother had died and for standing in rooms where no one knew how to ask what they needed, and she told them she would tell them tomorrow but stay anyway and listen tonight. "Thank you," he told the gate once. It pulsed. He pretended it was a coincidence. Outside, in the parts of the galaxy that believe nothing good lasts, rumors sharpened again. A leader with clean cuffs and hands that had never held an actual tool stood up in a cave. It is always a cave for men like him, and told a crowd he would make the city pay for its defiance. He spoke of destiny. He spoke of crowns. The crowd listened because hunger makes people hear promises as bread. Ships gathered. The wedge was gone, nursing a wound into a new doctrine, but something else had learned from it. A swarm stitched from the husks of surveillance drones and sand. It was not powerful, but it was everywhere. They came in flood. The city could dance once. It could not dance forever. It braced. This time the fight would not be won in spires or under levels. It would be won in fields, in the mapped and unmapped, in the day after the battle when the power to the water lines must restore clean at once or diseases slither in. Lyra sent commands and pleas and jokes. Elias fell asleep on a coil of cable and woke to find a child braiding string around his wrist. For luck, she said solemnly. He kept it on. The swarm hit. It bit at everything. The city shook like a dog coming out of a lake. The gate found new rhythms in old songs. They asked not to win, they asked to remain. They did, not elegantly, not quickly. They did because a queen refused to sleep, and a man who wore no crown taught machines to breathe, and because a woman who had been given 10 bad fighters made them better, and because engineers learned to speak poetry to pumps. They did because when hunger met promise at their door, bakers put out trays anyway and said, "Fight if you must, but eat first." The swarm died the way cowards do. It kept enough of itself to run, and it fled when it was done hurting and when the city was still standing and bored with it. They died less than their enemies wished and more than they'd planned. After, no one shouted victory. They changed filters and burnt the linens that had caught too much. They sang to children so the children would learn that the world still contains songs. The gate sighed. Elias slept at last, and dreamed of the old freighter's ladder under his hands, of Lyra's laugh when something small worked, of a door that opens both ways. Time piled. It does that. It covered the old cuts with new skin. It wrote Elias' name in fewer mouths and set it instead into bolts that held and pumps that hummed despite the sabotage of entropy. Men with clean cuffs discovered that building hurts more hands than breaking. Some changed professions. The black wedge never returned. It had learned an appropriate lesson. Endurance, not dominance, changes maps. On the first anniversary of the first fight, Lyra stood beneath the gate in a plain dress that seemed like beach light. She spoke quietly to those gathered. She did not thank heroes. She thanked farmers and sweepers and mechanics and the kind of knight who can fix a chair. She said the words a queen must to keep an empire whole. "We are one, we will remain, you are not alone." Then she turned, on impulse or plan, to the man who stood like part of the architecture. "Elias Rye," she said, "Crownless One." He stiffened like a dog hearing its name unexpectedly sweet. "You once asked the city to stand with you," she said. "It did. Will you ask it again now for nothing but old times? Will you ask it to remember that survival is a liturgy? The gate likes your voice." He smiled, and it was the first easy thing he had done in weeks. He put his hand on the gate. "City," he said, "stand." And the city stood. Not higher, not brighter, only steadier. People breathed the way one does when the doctor says the thing is manageable. Some cried because the word manageable is sometimes more beautiful than cure. After the brief ceremony, after bread, after work, because work follows everything, Elias walked the long corridor that led back to the rooms where he kept maps. He passed a window where stars hung indifferent and close. He thought of Earth, distant, imperfect, and of all the places between. A boy stood alone looking at the sky. He had the posture of someone poised to break or break open. He looked up at Elias the way children look at those who have done larger versions of things they dream of doing. "Are you a king?" the boy asked shyly. "No," Elias said. "I fix things." The boy considered that and nodded, fierce with the way understanding can make a spine straighten. "That's better," he said, and ran off because someone had shouted his name like the beginning of a game. Elias stood in the gold light and watched the boy's feet slap against the floor. He listened to the city's hum. the low heartbeat it had learned to trust because it had earned it with rust and blood and patience. He ran his thumb over the string on his wrist. He thought, perhaps that is what the gate meant. He walked to his window and watched a tug nudge a freighter into place and thought of small things aligned making large things possible. He lifted his hand once more in an old sailor's salute to nothing and everything, and went back to work, which is to say, to loving a place into tomorrow. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. Seasons turned not by weather. There was too much city here for seasons, but by rhythms of repair and ritual. They made new rituals out of necessity. Once a week at the hour when the water fields are at their stillest, someone read names. Not heroes, workers. The woman who rewired Section 12's breaker without losing body heat to the vacuum. The boy who organized a bucket line during a small fire. The man who taught 6 children to solder even though his hands shook from an old illness. Names thickened the air and warmed it. The gate got used to being touched. Children ran hands along it carefully and flinched at the not-quite shock it gave, proud to be noticed. Engineers used it as reference for calibrations because its hum was more exact than any metric they'd settled on. It stood not just as symbol but instrument. Elias avoided ceremonies when he could. He preferred the rooms where the walls inside showed and where people were allowed to swear. He took apprentices because it felt wrong not to. He was surprised to discover that teaching made him love the work more. He found a way to explain pressure that made a boy grin like a new planet had risen. He put a hand on a girl's shoulder while she welded and felt her tremor even though her bead was perfect. And when she had finished, he told her a story about the first time he had thought a valve would not open and how the trick, sometimes, is to step back and let your fear stand behind you, not inside. He did not live alone. He had tried. It made him a worse person. He found a small table and someone to sit across it who knew how to disagree without spoiling the bread. He stood with Lyra on balconies and did not touch because touching would have been a different story, and both of them belonged to this one. They laughed. He listened while she crafted sentences that could hold a nation. She listened while he named the sound a gearbox makes when it is almost happy. Rumors persisted because they always do. Someone on some world had found their own gate and it had called them Crownless too. Someone else had built a fake one and was selling victory in kits. A pirate lord sent Lyra a crown in a box as an insult. She melted it and poured it into a frame for a greenhouse window. When reporters asked what she thought of the insult, she smiled. "Children will watch vines through it," she said. "We make symbols useful." Crisis came as crises do, not from the direction they had braced, but the one they had ignored. The river shields had been used more than designed. A fault opened along a seam nobody had written down because the man who had written it down had died and the woman who had memorized his scribbles had thought her knowledge trivial. The fault flared into a breach. Water fled the fields, power followed. Half the city went dim in one long sigh. Panic wants to rise like tide. They did not let it. Lyra's staff did not strike the floor now. A look was enough. Elias ran. He ran with his apprentices, with 10 bad fighters who were no longer bad because they had been loved into competence, with children who pointed at shortcuts and with grandmothers who held doors open with their backs. The breach was a tearing sound in the bones. He pressed hands against metal. He felt the roll and snap, the give and insist. "We need a bridge," he said. "There is no bridge," someone else said, whose job was to know. "We will build one," he replied, not irritated, simply adjusting reality. He sent runners. He sent an angry argument down the hall at a man who wanted to stop a different leak first. He sent silent gratitude toward the place in his chest that held all the maps of pressure balanced like a cathedral. They found pipe long enough and strong. They found a girder. They found pieces of things that had been other things and persuaded them to be this thing. "Hold," he said, and put his back into a lever older than his oldest story. He strained. He heard his captain laugh in his head and say galactically, "Ah, fine, a real job." He pulled. The bridge fell into place. The river found it, climbed it, roared. Light came back slowly. Room by room, flicker by flicker, faces turned from shadows to detail. The city inhaled. The gate made a small sound like a coin struck against stone, which from it was applause. They repaired the long breach while eating, while sleeping, while crying, because there is no other way. Elias stood once on the new plate and felt the echo of a shift. He closed his eyes and saw the stress lines and understood that this was not the end of the problem. It was a scaffold. That is what most solutions are. He told Lyra later when the courtyard had long shadows and the air smelled like green things they were learning to keep alive again. "It will hold," he said. "Not if treated like a wall, only if treated like a wound. Cleaned, watched, respected. I would put that in a speech," she said, tired and happy. "Please don't," he said, and they laughed like colleagues, like old friends, like a pair that knows how to love a thing and not each other because there is not enough of them to go around, and that is fine. The black wedge found its name softened in the mouths of storytellers. They sang not of its edge, but of the day it missed. The man with clean cuffs died somewhere stupid, as men like him often do. His followers melted into other myths. People came to the city not to fight, but to learn. They went home to teach machines to breathe and children to stand and gates to do what they should. Years layered. The boy who had asked Elias about kings returned taller, with the posture of someone who had seen orbit. He asked for work. Elias put a wrench in his hand and stepped back and watched him meet metal. He was good with hands. "People will call you a prince," Elias warned. "Unkind only in the way honesty can be." The boy grinned. "They can call me late for dinner if they want," he said. Elias pretended not to be proud and failed. A day arrived with a ragged edge and a bright heart. A signal came from a world with sand seas and violet horizons. Their own gate had sung. It had not named a king. It had named a child, listener. They did not know what that meant. They asked the city to send the man who had taught his own gate to talk. Elias packed a bag. Lyra held out a hand. He took it. They held for a count that made the gate in the next room soften its light. "You'll come back," she said. "I always do," he replied, not promising, just telling a truth about himself. He traveled with a mechanic's roll and 2 books and clothes that could be burned without regret. He left a city that had learned to move and stand and asked its own heart to beat when called on. He found worlds that did not have his language and taught them to say the words machines understand in their own. He touched gates in a dozen flavors of old. Some recognized him. Some tolerated. One shocked him hard enough to put him on his ass and taught him something new about surrender. He did not wear a crown on any world. He wore a string that had once been a child's idea of luck and had become a piece of rope he could hold when other things wanted to drift. He returned longer in the tooth and with a scar under his jaw where a bolt had reminded him that even stories need caution. He returned to find Lyra older in the way leaders get older, with grace and with ruthless use of the chair when it is called for. He returned to a city whose children knew 3 kinds of pressure, the way children in other cities know 3 kinds of candy. He returned with a love that had not lessened, and a knowledge that he was an instrument, not a song. On a quiet night years after, a child, another child with hair like the dark part of the sky and a gap between her teeth where a new one would come, stood beneath the gate and looked up. "Do you have a name?" She asked it. The gate glowed faintly. No words appeared. Elias was there, fixing a sensor that had started to read dreams as anomalies. He wiped oil from his hands and came to stand beside her. "It has many," he said. "We call it the Scepter Gate. My grandmother would have called it trouble. Your grandmother might call it friend. It calls me Crownless." "What does it call me?" The girl asked not to be included but to test the size of a world with her small fists. "Let's see," he said, and stepped back, and the girl lifted her chin as people do when they ask to be seen not as they have been told they are but as they suspect they could be. The gate hummed. Light slid like fish under a surface. For a breath, nothing. For the next, words, small and shy, touched the air. "Keeper." The girl looked at Elias, eyes wide. "That's a good name," he said, and made sure not to cry because crying would make this about him, and here was a child at the beginning of a road. "It means you will hold things. Maybe doors, maybe hands, maybe stories, maybe this city." She nodded as if considering homework and went to tell her mother. Elias touched the gate once with 2 fingers, like a thanks you offer old friends who do not like fuss. Years after that, the city's bones creaked in a new place and held. The gate named a dozen crownless in other worlds, because the galaxy had learned that kings are a shape and a story, and sometimes a refusal. Humanity carried its scars not like medals but like maps, and taught others to read them. Elias grew old not gracefully but usefully. He took his coffee too strong and his apprentices too seriously, and his wins with less celebration than he ought. He did not become gentler, but he became farther-sighted. He stood again and again beneath the gate, not for his sake but to teach it the shape of hands that would hold it when he didn't. Once, not long before he set down his wrench for the last time, he stood beneath the gate at dusk. Light leaked in through high windows, softening everything. Lyra stood beside him. Her hair had collected silver like starlight. Her hands had never learned to be idle. "Do you ever think of the day it first named you?" she asked, not nostalgic, simply marking a point. "Sometimes," he said, "mostly when something refuses to work because it hasn't been asked nicely. You think it was asking you nicely." She smiled, small and rare. "I think it was asking me if I was listening," he said. He turned his head and found her looking at him as if he had answered something else. They stood and watched the city hold itself upright, watched ships come in, watched a child chase another child between columns that had seen war and breakfast and the end of world twice and did not care as long as someone swept them weakly. He touched the gate one last time and felt it pulse and pulse again. He imagined it saying farewell, but it was not. It was saying continue. He did. They all did. And when men told tales years later about the day a human walked under a thing built for crowns and made it remember what it meant to bind, those tales did not swell to dragons. They clipped themselves to tools and recipes and small acts of bravery on days when no one was looking. The city became a story of endurance, not conquest. The kingdom an engine that ran because many shoulders leaned. Somewhere else, far from spires and water fields, on a tiny station built from scavenged panels, a kid asked an old woman about kings. The old woman laughed until she had to sit down and wipe her eyes. "Kings," she said, "we don't do kings here, we do doors, we keep them open, we keep them repaired, we keep them." And across 1,000 light years a gate hummed faintly content. The galaxy did not kneel, it survived. That was better. It set tables, it filled them. It built bridges and workbenches and beds big enough to lay maps upon. It taught machines to breathe and children to listen. And if in quiet hours it wrote on the air a word for those who hold it together without asking for crowns, it wrote it softly and wiped it away, because some names are better as actions. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.